Hello, this is Eric Topol with Medscape Medicine and the Machine with my co-host Abraham Verghese. And this is really a special edition for us to get one of the leading lights of artificial intelligence in the world, Jeff Dean, who heads up Google AI. And so, Jeff, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, this is a real treat for us because you have now been at Google for, I think, 22 years. Is that right?
I think, yes, 22 years as of a few days ago.
Right. And what's amazing to me is your background. I want to just get back into that for a second. In a recent book by Kate Metz, who's a New York Times tech journalist, called Genius Makers. Obviously, you're one of the protagonists in there, but I didn't know this about you, Jeff. I want to get your comment. You grew up across the globe. Parents took you family from Hawaii, where he was born, to Somalia, where he helped run a refugee camp during his middle school years. High school senior in Atlanta, Georgia, where his father worked for the CDC. He built a software tool for the CDC that helped researchers collect disease data. And nearly 4 decades later, it remained a staple of epidemiology across the developing world. I'm just going to stop there because I didn't know about this. And there's this thing called a pandemic. Can you help us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my father is an epidemiologist, and so we traveled around quite a lot. And my mom studied medical anthropology, and so that combination of careers and also a bit of like wanderlust of like going to new places. And I was an only child, so I went along for the ride, but ended up living in lots of different places. As part of a high school internship, I ended up doing an internship at CDC during high school, writing some software for basically doing outbreak investigations for epidemics. As you probably know, epidemiologists have a number of like very specialized statistics that most statistical packages don't necessarily support very well. And it's really important also to be able to provide software that can be run all around the world on relatively low-end computers at that time. And so I started writing some software that would provide the right kinds of data collection, data analysis tools that could be run in a fairly lightweight way for epidemiologists all around the world. And people would, this was before the internet, so it would get distributed by, people would show up with like 3 floppy disks with the software on it, and they would make 40 copies for people and teach them how to use it, and then it would kind of propagate from there. And it's still my 7th or 8th most cited work.
Amazing, so 40 years ago. And then, the fact that your expertise was in building a system out of millions of computers that behave like one. Your colleague, Sebastian Thrun, no one in history of computing had ever done that. So you've had a few accomplishments. And before I turn it over to Abraham, I thought we get a little humor in here. Also, in this book, it alludes to your, what they call the Chuck Norris facts about you. Jeff Dean's PIN is the last 4 digits of pi. That's pretty good. The speed of light in a vacuum used to be 35 mph. Then Jeff Dean spent a weekend optimizing physics. Jeff Dean compiles and runs his code before submitting, but only to check for compiler and CPU bugs. So and there's so much here, Jeff. So anyway, let me turn it to Abraham to get things going.
Yeah, just one point on that. That's like an April Fool's joke from many years ago that some of my colleagues put up in our internal website, and people could submit like amusing anecdotes like that, and people would rate them. And so there's quite a mechanism involved in this, but I appreciate them all.
Jeff, it's such a pleasure to get to talk to you. I've been reading about you, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between Google and Stanford. So I think some of our folks have trained with you, and it's just a pleasure. I want to take you back to the EPI software that you worked on. I mean, is that the same thing that you worked on with HIV/AIDS for the WHO? Was that an evolution of that software? And it brings me to the question of what you think about our current pandemic. And I know your active mind must have turned to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so the way the software evolved is I started in school, and then every summer I would do a new version of it. And the first couple summers I did at CDC as sort of follow-on internships. And then one of my colleagues who was working at CDC moved to the World Health Organization in Geneva and said, hey, do you want to come to Geneva for the summer instead of Atlanta? And I'm like, well, that sounds new and exciting. Why don't I do that? And so then the next few versions of that epidemiological software were done there. And I also started working on some software to help sort of predict the future trajectory of HIV infections and AIDS cases around the world based on sort of early assessments of seroprevalence rates in different communities and so on, working in the global program on AIDS there. And so it sort of was an evolution of the work I was already doing and some follow-on additional work to help do more sort of forecasting specific to the HIV pandemic. And obviously, the current pandemic is obviously tragic in a lot of ways and really has dramatically affected the world. And HIV is very different than COVID in some ways, but I think it's also reflective of, the public health community needing to come together and to tell people what to do to keep themselves safe. And as we learn more, the sort of guidance obviously changes, but I think, COVID being an airborne disease is obviously much more transmissible in some ways, in many ways. So there are some commonalities, but also some differences. And I think the reaction of the public health community has been pretty good here. And the deployment of vaccines in such rapid fashion is really quite remarkable and a testament to credit to all the scientists involved in that, because it's really, I think, helped the world move from what could have been even worse to a better situation. Obviously, we're not completely out of it yet, but.
Right, unfortunately. So, the deep learning era, which obviously you've played a major role, it seemed to really get legs with the cat video story. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because obviously you were very much involved.
Sure. So actually, I'd gotten introduced to neural networks in 1990 when there was kind of an initial wave of excitement about neural networks and what they could do. And at that time, they could show, I would say, really interesting results on teeny problems. But they couldn't really scale to anything of significance. But it seemed kind of like an interesting way of approaching solving some kinds of learning problems. And so there was a big wave of excitement and then a bit of a trough of disillusionment. But I was kind of a senior in college during that first wave of excitement. And I was like, oh, these are great. Like, what if we could just make bigger ones? And so I did a senior thesis on parallel training. So using 32 processors to train neural networks instead of just one, because I felt like maybe we needed just a bit more compute and then we could make them do amazing things. I was completely wrong. Turned out we needed about 1 million times as much compute, not 32. But then starting around, I would say like 2006 or 7 or 8, we started to actually have that much compute thanks to Moore's law, in the world. And so researchers in a few universities kind of started to think about, we're starting to see good results on using neural networks for actually a fairly broad set of different problems in speech and early, computer vision problems. And so I heard about that along with a few others at Google, and we decided to start a project to train very large neural networks using our, computers in our data centers. And so we put together some software that enabled us to train, using thousands of computers. And one of the things we did was we decided to train a model using an unsupervised learning algorithm. So we took 10 million randomly selected frames from YouTube videos, and we trained a model using an unsupervised learning algorithm. And the system learned to recognize a whole bunch of different kinds of objects. And it being YouTube, of course, it learned to recognize cats because YouTube is full of cats. And it the really interesting thing about that is it developed this ability to have a neuron that could recognize whether a cat face was in the frame without ever being told what a cat was. And so just from patterns and data and building higher and higher levels of abstraction through this unsupervised learning algorithm, the system developed a neuron that could tell whether there was a cat face there or not. And that was pretty remarkable. And then you could then train it with some supervised data, say, okay, this is a car, this is a truck, or whatever, and get better results than if you just had done the supervised training. And so I think that was kind of eye-opening to us, and it showed that scaling these kinds of models to larger sizes would actually produce good results. And it sort of started a whole decade of sort of successful uses at Google and elsewhere of using neural nets for a wide variety of different things: speech recognition, images, language understanding, and so on, as well as some obviously applications in healthcare and medical diagnostics.
I think one of the things in healthcare that greatly interests our audience is the electronic health record, which, as you know, has been both a major boon and also a major source of frustration, and the amount of time that we wind up spending on these systems, which, you know, they have not really lived up to their initial promise. But I think what's very exciting is some of the work that you've done on natural language processing, and where do you see the EHR evolving? And give us a sense of hope, if you will, for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I know that doctors today have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the EHR and the way in which they have to interact with it, because it sort of takes away from time they could be spending with patients. But it's also a repository of really valuable information about, you know, decisions they've made about a patient and then the outcomes that happen. So we've done some work in collaboration with different organizations on using de-identified medical records in models that are kind of similar to how we train natural language models. So one of the things you want to be able to do in natural language is to take some prefix of a piece of text and then predict what is the next word or what is the next sequence of words that's going to occur. And that can help you, like if you're typing in a Gmail message, we can help you by, you know, suggesting like this is how you might complete the sentence so you can save typing and so on. But it turns out that same kind of approach can be used for helping give clinicians suggestions about what might happen next in a medical record for a particular patient. So if you think about a medical record, it's a whole sequence of events. And if you have the identified medical records, you can take a prefix of a medical record and try to predict either the individual events or maybe some high-level attributes about the succeeding events, like will this patient develop diabetes in the next 12 months? And you can actually become pretty good at predicting a lot of things that clinicians might care about in their, you know, thinking about how they might want to, you know, treat a particular patient or treat a particular condition a patient is seeing. So you can, for example, suggest, you know, here are 5 diagnoses that might make sense given the patient's current symptoms plus their past medical history, based on learning from other de-identified medical records. So if you think about a clinician, you know, they go to medical school, they do residency, they get trained, and they see, you know, maybe 20,000 patients in their career or something. And that's extremely useful, but it also means that they have somewhat limited experience, especially with really rare things they might never see in their career. And so I think an aspirational goal, which is really hard to achieve for a whole bunch of reasons, but could every past medical decision be used to help inform every future medical decision, right? I think aspirationally that would be great because we would be learning from the collective wisdom of what worked and what didn't work on, you know, billions of people in order to help provide better care for everyone in the future. And you know, that's complicated, and we can talk about some of the reasons why it's complicated, but it's a good kind of North Star about what we might be able to achieve if we put our minds to it.
Yeah, I do think it's achievable. You know, the whole idea of a digital infrastructure and twinning and nearest neighbor analysis, if we get all the data, I know Kai-Fu Lee and I wrote about this, takes a planet kind of big thinking, but someday that would be extraordinary. But for the here and now, Jeff, you and I were at a conference, and by the way, what's great is so many publications from Google on AI in healthcare. But one of the ones that was striking to cement the power of training neural networks was the retina. And you'll recall, which is not because this is the way we want to determine if a person is a male or female, but to look at the retina and to train that you could get, instead of 50% accuracy from people like Pierce Keen, a noted retina expert, to 97% accuracy of whether it's a male or a female from putting the photo of the retina through the neural network. That kind of tells a lot of people, particularly the Medscape audience, that human eyes are not as good as trained machine eyes. And I think, is that something that we can at least say firmly right now, that, and of course, the combination may be even better?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about that work is from the retinal image alone, a neural network that had been trained on a bunch of retinal images could learn to predict biological sex from the retinal image by itself. And it could also predict a bunch of other things that are also relevant to cardiovascular risk that I think also ophthalmologists and even trained sort of eye specialists couldn't necessarily pick up on. So that sort of tells me that there are lurking in lots of health information subtle signs of things that the right framing of the problem and machine learning on it might be able to pick up things that are complementary to the things that human clinicians already pick up on. And so I do think the combination of these computing systems plus trained professionals will provide better outcomes than either one of them alone, for sure.
Yeah, just before we leave that topic of the eye, I think it's really extraordinary to see that has now been built out, not just, as you mentioned, for potential of tracking diabetes, glucose regulation, blood pressure regulation, hepatobiliary disease, the calcium score of the coronary arteries through the retina, Alzheimer's disease potentially as a window to neurodegenerative diseases. I mean, it's just, the list keeps getting longer now. Google has done a lot of work for diabetic retinopathy, which I think we know is half of diabetics never get screened. And you've done a lot of work with the Aravinda India health system, which is a notable one. Can you tell us where that stands? Is that really what the way of the future that we should be screening for diabetic retinopathy?
Sure. I mean, I think the work we've been doing on diabetic retinopathy is kind of one of the earliest problems in medical imaging diagnostics that we started looking at because there's a real large need for additional screening capacity around the world. And in many parts of the world, there just aren't enough clinicians, ophthalmologists, who you actually need a fair amount of special training to look at a retinal image and then assess, does that retinal image show signs of diabetic retinopathy on a 5-point scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's, it's a really important disease because if you catch this in time, you can actually prevent, blindness or partial loss of vision. But if you don't catch it in time, you can't. But if you do catch it in time, it's actually very treatable. And so the ability to screen more people will actually prevent blindness that is entirely preventable. And so we've actually done a sort of fairly detailed progression from early research projects to, is this possible? Can we actually train a machine learning model to assess whether a retinal image shows diabetic signs of retinopathy? And the earliest study we did, we were able to sort of show that it was on par or perhaps slightly better than board certified ophthalmologists in the US. And then with some additional refinement of how we labeled the training data and how we trained the model, we're actually able to get it to be on par with retinal specialists who have additional training in this, which is kind of the gold standard of care in this area. And then we've been working with our partners in a number of places, including India, Thailand, Germany, and France, to actually deploy this in real clinical settings and do screening. And so we've just reached a milestone of 50,000 patients screened with this approach, and the numbers are sort of continuing to go up, which is, nice to see things that are not just research papers, but are also actually deployed in the world. And then we've been looking at a bunch of other modalities of medical imaging in sort of, after we saw the early success in diabetic retinopathy, we realized that this was a generally repeatable pattern of other medical imaging modalities, and you could probably get good results there with kind of careful attention to lots of things like collecting the right kind of training data, training the right kind of model, evaluating it appropriately, and so on.
Medicine and the Machine will be right back.
Welcome to Medscape's latest podcast series, Medicine and the Machine, featuring Medscape's editor-in-chief, Dr. Eric Topol, and master storyteller and clinician, Dr. Abraham Verghese. Remember, you can find the latest in medical news, expert perspectives, clinical tools, continuing medical education, and more at medscape.com.
One of the things that your group has done so well is to create open source programs or ways of consolidating the process of performing AI. And reading about your work, it seems to me there are endless applications. I mean, you could and you have looked at almost every sector of life and every industry. How do you sort of prioritize things? And in healthcare, where do you see the main challenges and the most important challenges that remain that you will bring your focus to?
Our group realized that there were a lot of potential applications of machine learning in the world in like virtually every sector of activity of human endeavor, I guess. And part of the reason is, between the period of say 2010 and 2013 or 14, effectively computers developed the ability to see. And you can imagine that that's pretty transformative on a lot of things. If you think back to evolutionary times, when animals evolved eyes, I suspect that was a big deal. And we're sort of at the same point in computing a few years ago. And that has meant that there's a really broad set of uses of the newfound capabilities of being able to see. And so one of the things we wanted to do was make software packages and software tools available to those who were trying to apply machine learning to different settings. And so that's why we developed a system called TensorFlow and released that as an open source package for people to kind of use in whatever way they want. We had an Apache 2 license, which, I'm not a lawyer, but it sort of means do whatever you want with it. And that enables people to use it in lots of different settings. And so I think and it has been used by, it's been downloaded, I think, 100 million times or something, which is kind of remarkable for a fairly obscure programmer specific kind of tool. But in the medical setting, I think people are seeing the potential of machine learning, both on kind of medical record data, but also on medical imaging modalities. And so we want to make tools that make that easy to deploy these systems. In the medical setting, I think there are a lot of complicated regulatory and privacy issues that kind of, for good reason, impede the rollout of these systems in ways that maybe don't exist in sort of less regulated settings, which is appropriate, but I think it's also good to realize that there's real potential here, and we should make sure that we do this safely, but also that we get these things out into the world in ways that are, positive for the world and the medical outcomes that we think can be improved.
Well, speaking of that, it's a great example of another body of work that you all have done on skin lesions, skin problems. And you developed DermAssist, which I understand has been or is being released in Europe, having gotten the regulatory approval for that, to help individuals to make a screening of whatever skin issue that they're potentially concerned about by taking a picture and getting automated preliminary diagnosis. That's not here in the US, different kind of regulatory hurdles. But can you tell us about DermAssist? Because that's one of the most common reasons why a person goes to see a doctor.
Yeah, and actually it turns out dermatologist appointments are one of the hardest specialists to get an appointment with because they're oversubscribed. And so sometimes, you know, a general clinician will try to make a diagnosis, and sometimes you'll get referred to a dermatologist. And you know, so it's definitely something where you don't need specialized equipment necessarily to actually capture the right information in order to be able to then look at it and sort of assess it. And so we've sort of been following a similar path to what we've been following in the diabetic retinopathy work, where we first wanted to gather a data set, evaluate it in a sort of research setting, see if we could, for a wide variety of different skin tones and a wide variety of different conditions, be able to have something that is, high enough quality to think about putting through a regulatory process. And so we've now sort of done several iterations of improving the set of data that we have to make it more representative, to put it through the regulatory process in Europe, as you mentioned, and to roll that out so that it can actually be used by real users, or in the process of rolling it out, to assess skin conditions. So if you have like a rash on your arm, you can take a picture of it and it will sort of provide, a few different alternatives of what this might be. And then you can sort of decide what to do, given that preliminary, it's not a diagnosis, but it's a sort of an assessment of what might be there.
One of the pushbacks on AI, Jeff, early on was that there was a way that AI could sometimes magnify these sort of inequities in society and make them seem and no one would be aware that it was actually doing that until you took a careful look. Have we gotten better at that? Have we built in more safeguards? Is this an issue that we can worry about a little less, or is it a continuing issue?
No, I think anytime you're thinking about deploying a machine learning model or an AI system in the world, you need to be conscious and aware of many different aspects of that process and how they can introduce bias or fairness issues, or ways in which that system interacts with people. You often want an interpretable model so that people can understand, if the model is saying this, why is it saying that? And that's throughout the whole process. That's looking at the data set, looking at the kinds of algorithms you're doing, looking at the ways you evaluate it. Often you want to be careful to not just evaluate it and report a single number. You want to look at different subsets of the population that might be affected, and look at how it performs on, say, different ethnicities, for, say, dermatology-related work, or different skin tones. And so these are all things that we pay attention to, and we think everyone deploying machine learning models, particularly ones that have that are making real consequential decisions in people's lives, really should be paying attention to. And one of the things that we did in 2018 is put out a set of principles by which we think about, in a sort of structured way, for every use of machine learning at Google, what are the things we should be thinking about? And things like, they should avoid creating unfair bias, that they should be, interpretable by humans, and so on. And these are important issues. They continue to be issues, and will require everyone's attention to make sure that we don't, as you say, take data, for example, from the world as it is, and then automate some process so that we can take something that is not, the world as it is, and make it sort of magnify or accelerate the effects of improper decisions. And instead, we need to make sure that we take the world as we would like it to be, and make sure that our machine learning models are as close to that goal as we can get.
Going back just for a second to Abraham's point about the electronic health records, as you know, Jeff, there are burgeoning efforts for keyboard liberation for taking the conversation and making a synthetic note based on that, that could be edited by both the patient and machine learned NLP for the doctor or clinician. Do you see that as something imminent? Because that could be the biggest AI favorite tool in the history of medicine, like if you could get rid of keyboards.
Yeah, I mean, our group has done a little bit of work on sort of, can you, from a audio recording of a patient-doctor conversation, create a draft of a medical note that a clinician can then, mostly just edit a little bit, as opposed to like having to type up a lengthy note. Because as we all know, often clinicians sort of copy and paste the last note and sort of don't really edit it appropriately. And that's partly because it's just very cumbersome and unwieldy to interact with some of these systems. And speech and voice are a more natural way of sort of perhaps creating notes, creating summarized notes from conversations is also perhaps a good assistive tool that could really help both reduce the clinical burden on clinicians, but also perhaps create higher quality information in the medical record itself, which I think would be, fantastic. So,
do you worry about, as you make these open source machine learning software available to everyone, do you worry about people putting it to nefarious use? And then conversely, do you worry about excess government regulation coming in to monitor it to a point where it begins to snuff out the capability to do research and advance the cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of technologies, they can be, machine learning can be put to both positive and negative uses in the world. And, I think by and of itself, it is kind of a neutral thing. But when you take that approach and apply it to something, that's where you're making real conscious decisions about, what is the system going to do? How is it going to impact, this person, this populace, this community, or the world? And so there's a bunch of things that obviously, now that, say, computer vision works, that has amazing uses in medical diagnostics, but it also could be used to create autonomous weapons. And so I think, we as society and governments and other involved constituencies need to make decisions about what kinds of uses we want to allow, what kinds of things we don't want to allow. And I think in terms of regulation, I think it's really much more about particular uses that are important to look at. And in many kinds of areas, there's already an existing regulatory framework, say for medical devices or pharmaceutical sort of approval processes and that kind of thing. And I think with some adaptation to what machine learning is able to do in that space, you already have kind of a fairly well-evolved regulatory framework that is pretty serviceable. For other kinds of things, like say autonomous vehicles, there's less of a regulatory framework, and that's an area where you'll want governments to weigh in on what is appropriate and what is not in a new regulatory framework that has to be essentially created from nothing.
And speaking of things that are a little bit away from the medical space, like autonomous vehicles, two what I would consider, pretty remarkable breakthroughs in AI that you and your colleagues at Google were involved in very recently, both published in Nature, which is kind of an interesting place to have these AI papers. I'd like to get your comments on both of them. One is the work that was done for AI to design chips that normally would take months, if not years, to be done in minutes or hours, whatever. And the other is the work on protein structure. That is, that any sequence of amino acids could predict in 3D and all the folding for essentially, now a vast majority of proteins in the human proteome, but then eventually perhaps all proteins. Obviously, that has implications for drug discovery and understanding the biology in man and elsewhere. Can you just comment? Because these things are not what the medical community may not be aware of this stuff.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the chip design work, I think, is a bit further afield from the medical community, but is interesting. So one of the stages in designing a computer chip is you kind of have the actual sort of logic and transistors that you want to put on the surface of the chip, but you don't know where to put them. And so you often have human sort of physical design engineers sit there and sort of play this complicated game of where should we put this thing in order to minimize actually quite a number of different constraints. There's like the length of wires between different pieces, there's the amount of power that the chip will consume, and the area that the chip will consume. And you want to make it as small as possible and consume as little power as possible and minimize wire length, basically. And so it turns out, using a reinforcement learning algorithm where you sort of take a bunch of actions, and then at the end of those actions, you get a reward. This is similar to how our DeepMind colleagues sort of mastered the game of Go, where you can essentially play a bunch of moves in Go, and then at the end, you get a reward signal of did you win or lose. Here, you can get a reward signal that is a bit more multidimensional, like the actual size of the chip and the power that it will consume and so on. But you can essentially play the game of placing the components of the chip and see how well you did. And then you can try again, given the feedback you got from the previous time. And it turns out this is a much higher dimensional problem space than Go. But you can actually learn to do this successfully in an automated way instead of taking, a team of 10 people, many weeks or months to do this process. And so that's kind of exciting, and it results in perhaps smaller chips created more quickly and rolled out into the world, which is nice. And one bit of meta information, we have these custom chips called tensor processing units that we developed at Google for machine learning. And we ran the chip layout algorithm for a future version of a TPU on an older version of a TPU. So kind of neat. In terms of the protein folding, I think that's great work from our colleagues at DeepMind, and the implications of that I think are still not. The work was just released in the last few weeks, so I think it's not exactly clear what the implications will be, but it is really a testament to the fact that we can now tackle some of these basic problems in science with machine learning and develop new capabilities that then will sort of enable us to do things we couldn't do before, and will affect lots of downstream fields and uses. So,
well, and also as Abraham emphasized early on in our conversation, that it was made fully open source to the biomedical community, which is fantastic. So we're going to wrap up because otherwise we want to talk to you for all day and all week. But I'll let Abraham say some things, and then I'll finish up with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I must say, I'm just struck by the fact, Jeff, that we're talking about these tremendous advances in artificial intelligence, but it's really human intelligence. It's individuals like yourself and others at Google. And yet we're living in a time when, a certain obstinacy or a lack of intelligence is getting us into this terrible mess with this virus. I mean, I'm actually being more charitable than my co-host. He uses more choice words to describe this. Are you struck by this paradox of, the tremendous advances and the human intellect at its most amazing in the form of the work you guys do, and then the sort of disorder that we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see. Like, on the one side, we have this amazing scientific achievement of developing a vaccine and deploying it to hundreds of millions of people in 11 months or whatever it was. That's just like extraordinary. And then at the other side, we have kind of a number of policy decisions and hesitancy of people to take vaccines, and also, obvious real inequity issues of how do we get vaccine to everyone in the world as quickly as possible. And so there's definite, disinformation, misinformation in the world, and that can get amplified, and people sort of see that and sort of start to act on it in ways that I think is really unfortunate. I think, as a scientist, I like fact-based conversations and dialogue and rationality, and that's a really great thing for the world when that happens, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, well put. I guess, Jeff, just to say, we're really grateful for your joining us. It's pretty clear that AI in medicine and healthcare is still in the early phase, but you and your colleagues have really worked hard to move the needle and deserve a lot of credit. You publish widely, frequently. You make a lot of things open source, and in many ways, you are an ally to the medical community, and hopefully our clinicians won't be threatened by AI, but rather see it as a potential help, lean on machines, if you will, as we get further along. And obviously, we still need a lot more validation. We need the prospective studies. Ideally, if we can get randomized trials. I know you're into all that stuff, and I just want to thank you. And some people have a mistrust or whatever for tech titans. I think it's misplaced. I don't have any relationship with Google, but I'm also, really impressed with what you all are doing, and we look to you as well as the other entities that are working in this space to help get medicine to where it ought to be, which isn't where it is today. So thanks so much for joining, and we're going to hopefully get back with you over the next phase to look at the progress that we're making, because I hope you think that there's still a long ways to go here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the potential of machine learning in medicine is really just at its infancy, and the ability for us to help give everyone in the world better medical care, better information about their own medical condition, give clinicians better advice about what kinds of things they should be thinking or decisions is really remarkable, but still largely not rolled out in the world. And so how do we move from where we are to where we could be?
All right, well, full circle from your work for pandemic preparedness 40 years ago to your work now in AI. We'll be following you closely, and thanks so much for joining us.